Yes, so thanks to the organizers again. I would also like to briefly second what Thomas said, like on Thursday, when he kind of said that some of us would have been very happy if the lineup had been a bit more kind of diverse with regard to gender difference. I think it's very sad that the attempts which were made to invite female main speakers were unsuccessful. Thomas went on Thursday to say that he at least could contribute a lot to the content diversity. He would talk about something completely different from any of the preceding speakers. I unfortunately cannot do this. I'm talking mostly about almost the same topic as Paul Näger did before me. But I'm looking at this problem and other problems from a perspective of realism about powers. And as you know, kind of like there has been this enormous revival of interest in realism about powers in the last 25 years in metaphysics. It has been one of the biggest developments actually there. And what I want to discuss is the influence of the revival of realism about powers on two key questions for this conference. On the one hand, the question of downward causation, how we should think about downward causation, and in particular Kim's argument. And second, the question how we should think about the relation between freedom and determinism. And I do think for both questions, the revival of powers is a kind of real game changer. I do want to suggest that a robust realism about powers allows us to answer in a new way Kim's causal exclusion argument. And I think it also allows us to show how an indeterministic element can be involved in free agency, even if we did believe that there were deterministic microphysical levels in nature. And I start by very briefly presenting some features of the kind of realism about powers I like and I presuppose for the talk. Then I will go into Kim's exclusion argument. I guess I won't have to rerun this argument. Paul Näger has done this much better than I could have done before me. Then I'll show that an analogous argument can be constructed to the effect that powers are causally irrelevant for the changes that happen when they are manifested. And since for realists about powers, I think this latter result would be unacceptable, I will suggest that such realists must consider the causal influence of powers to be compatible with the causal influence of certain events which are involved in the manifestations of these powers. And this compatibility result, I will then argue, can likewise be applied to the relation between the causal influence of higher and lower level phenomena. So that's part 2. And then in the last part of the talk, if I still have time, I will briefly turn to the question of why, even when one conceives of free agency in terms of the exercise of powers and capacities, there are grounds for believing that the relevant capacities are indeterministic, before showing how this is compatible with the assumption of full microphysical determinism. So I do not, in fact, believe that microphysical determinism is a plausible hypothesis, but I do think it's a worthwhile question to ask ourselves what would be the case if it were true. Okay. So let's briefly start with kind of robust realism about powers. And the robust realism about powers, which I will not argue for here, but which I will presuppose here, is a very robust and some may say even naive kind of neo-Aristotelian cum George Molnar one. According to these views, powers, or they are also sometimes called capacities, and I will use these terms interchangeably here. Powers are genuine properties of substances or other entities which are essentially directed at certain changes. And these changes are usually called the characteristic manifestations of these powers. So for instance, the power of a positively charged particle to attract an electron is directed at the attraction of an electron. Or the power of a certain amount of water to dissolve a piece of sugar is directed at the dissolution of sugar. And when we talk in this way, we are usually conveniently vague about what the thing which is the manifestation and which the power is directed at precisely is. And there are different candidates, so to speak, in the offing here. So first, the process of the sugars being dissolved, and second, the end state of this process, the sugars having been dissolved, sugars having been fully dissolved. On my view, it is the first item, the process, rather than the second, the end state, which a power is essentially directed at least for powers in nature. And I think the reason is the following. No power in nature is a power to bring about a certain end state or result in any way whatsoever. So I see only really clearly, the only kind of clear exception I can think of would be something like omnipotence, but omnipotence is not a natural power. I think the manifestations of all natural powers are process-specific. So for instance, it has often been pointed out that the power of a specific medicine to cure a headache is not manifested whenever someone ceases to have a headache after he has ingested the medicine. Why? Well, the medicine might just work as a placebo. He might just believe that's kind of like the medicine will finish the headache, and by autosuggestion he will cease to have the headache. And in this case, it's not the curing or healing power of the medicine which is manifested in his getting rid of the headache. And I think we should both accept the process specificity of power manifestations, and I will also presuppose in the following that the best way to capture this process specificity is to assume that the characteristic manifestation of a power is a type of process which leads to a specific result and not the result or end state itself. And I will call this process the manifestation process. So I should add, as a very quick aside for people who know the debate about processes in action theory, by process here I do not specifically mean ongoing, not completed processes which are described in continuous form. Process just is meant to capture that the end state must be reached in a specific way and not in any way whatsoever. Now, a manifestation process typically involves a sequence of distinguishable stages which follow one another in a certain order. So take, for instance, the case of water dissolving a cube of sugar. And this process evolves in something like the following way, if we describe it a bit naively. So the water softens up the surface of the cube, breaking the surface tension of the cube of sugar. Then the water seeps in and starts to moisten the inside of the cube, progressively breaking up the inside structure, and so on and so on. And at the end, the piece of sugar is fully dissolved. Now, there are two fundamentally different ways of how to think about the nature of such a process. You could either assume that the process just is the sequence of the events I have described, where the steps taken by themselves can be described independently of any reference to powers and are just linked to one another by Humean event causation. That would be one option. And Roland Stout has, I think, very usefully called this a Russellian conception of processes. So nothing else on this view is required for the process to evolve. On Aristotelian conception of processes, by contrast, equating the manifestation process with this event causal sequence would be fundamentally mistaken. The manifestations of the powers of sugar and the water will involve such an event causal sequence, but the manifestation is not nothing over and above the sequence. Only if the different stages and the transitions between them and the temporal order are due to the underlying powers being continuously exerted or exercised do we have a process of water dissolving sugar. And I believe there are several reasons why the latter, the Aristotelian account of processes, is kind of preferable. And I cannot go into these reasons there. I think one reason, which will only briefly come up later, is the kind of old problem of deviant causal chains. But I'll just assume the superiority of the Aristotelian accounts there. I will not argue for it. So in addition to taking the directedness feature of power seriously, the robust realism I am advocating here also rejects the possibility of a general reduction of the manifestation of powers to the event causal influence of events which can be characterized without reference to powers. It merits emphasis, though, that this non-reducibility thesis about powers and their manifestations does not yet by itself say anything about the relation between lower level and higher level phenomena in nature and their respective causal roles. So what it claims is only the non-reduction of powers and their exercises to non-power properties, while remaining silent, or so it seems at least, on the issue of whether the causal role of mental or microphysical properties can be reduced to or is excluded by the causal role of microphysical properties. Or so it seems. So I will argue later that this is only an appearance. There is some interesting consequence for the latter question too. Okay, let me very briefly, sketch a second feature of my preferred stripe of powers realism, and this has to do with the identity criteria for power. So powers, generally assumed, cannot be manifested under any conditions whatsoever, at least kind of powers in nature. But most of them need propitious external circumstances for their manifestations. And for some powers, and these are usually called dispositions, the power has to be manifested, or has at least begin to manifest, if the external circumstances are propitious. But not all powers are dispositions. So even when the external conditions are propitious, some powers do not have to be necessarily manifested or even begin to be manifested. So their manifestations, for instance, may only have a certain probability. Then we have something I will call a mere tendency or an indeterministic tendency. Or we could also have a two-way power, where again the thing is different. And now what I think, what in my view individuates a power, is a combination of the following three factors, 1 to 3. First, what the power is a power for, so it's characteristic manifestation. Second, the conditions for the exercise or manifestations of the power. And lastly, how closely the presence of the opportunity of these external manifestations and the actual exercise of the power is linked. So whether a power must always be manifested, whether an opportunity occurs, or only is probably manifested, or it's a two-way power. And in my view, you need all three factors to kind of individuate powers. And this is not a generally accepted view. I think most people think it's only one, the first one that you need. But I'll presuppose that you need all three. Okay, so much for the warming up. So that's kind of part one. Now let's go to downward causation. And here I can, for my first part, very kind of conveniently draw on Paul's presentation of Kim's downward causation argument. And I will then kind of develop what I think is a completely parallel argument for the case of powers. And then I will show how the response to the second argument helps with dealing with Kim's own argument. So, as you kind of know, and this has already come up, the backdrop of Kim's argument is this kind of layered model of reality, which starts off from a kind of lowest microphysical levels and then goes upwards through levels of progressively more complex phenomena. And there has also been mentioned the issue with this very vexed question how we can distinguish these levels, and I'm doubtful whether there is any kind of good way to do this, but let's bracket this here. And the idea is that the higher level phenomena are taken to arise from and depend on processes or phenomena of the comparatively lower level and ultimately the fundamental level. And Kim thinks that once we accept this layered model, then together with two further naturalist theses, we get an immediate difficulty for the idea that there could be anything like mental causation. First, the principle of physical closure, and second, the principle that you can only cause a supervening event by causing the base event, which it supervenes on. So I don't think I have to repeat any of this. You will still remember it from the last talk. And Kim thinks that the principle of physical closure kind of excludes what I kind of have called the arrow A, so the causation from M1 to P2, while the principle that you can only cause M2 by causing P2 excludes that M1 can cause M2. I think that's, I guess everyone still knows the details from 1 hour and a half ago. Okay, now as many philosophers have noted, Kim's argument, if successful, not only applies to the relation between mental and underlying physical events, it is a general argument scheme which can be applied to the relation between any two layers of reality, whenever one is held to be more fundamental or basic than the other, and some kind of supervenience seems plausible. So we get the very same result of causal impotence not only for mental phenomena, but also for all microphysical phenomena. And this has made Kim's argument extremely hard to accept, even for like pretty hard-nosed naturalists, who do perhaps not particularly care about the causal relevance of the mental, but who do care about the causal relevance of biology or organic chemistry. And to very many of them, the general consequence of Kim's argument has amounted to nothing less than a reductio ad absurdum of its premises. And there's, well, a huge literature on why Kim's argument doesn't work. And I think there are very good arguments there, and I don't want to kind of go into them here. But what I would like to point out is that while many of the answers to Kim very much depart from his background view of reality, and also from his views on causation, most of the proposed solutions have shared Kim's generally Humean background, or at least they haven't kind of hinged on rejecting it. So they usually do not assume these solutions that powers construed realistically play any essential role when it comes to explaining downward or cross-level causal influence. And so I think it's kind of a very natural question to ask, for a realist about powers at least, does realism about powers make a difference to the prospects of Kim's argument? And that is the question I will try to answer in the following. And to do this, I think I will take a slightly circuitous route, because I will go via a parallel argument which shares the general structure of Kim's argument, but applies to the causal relevance of powers, rather than to the causal influence of mental or higher order properties, and seems to exclude the causal relevance of powers in general. And that's what I'll do in this section. So when we consider the relationship between powers on the one hand and the events involved in the manifestation process and the end state of these processes on the other hand, the question arises, I think naturally arises, what role powers play in the production of these later events and states. So when a glass breaks because it is fragile, for instance because I let it drop and it breaks on hitting the ground, and the fragility manifests itself in the breaking, I think it's very, very natural to think that the fragility must somehow causally contribute to the end state of this process, the glass being broken, and to the steps which happened during the manifestation process. The power of fragility, I think, must have made a difference, and it's extremely plausible to think this is a causal difference. Moreover, it is not just the possession or presence of the power which must make a difference, but also its exercise, without which the breaking would not have occurred. And it is very crucial to keep these two things apart, because the presence of a power can make a difference even when the power is not exercised. So for instance, you have a crazy dictator who notes the fragility of the glass and reacts to this fragility by destroying the glass with a bomb which would have shattered anything, even things which are not fragile. Here the presence of fragility did make a difference to the glass's breaking, because the dictator only detonated this bomb because he realized the glass was fragile. Nonetheless, the fragility of the glass was not exercised. And a similar thing you have in the earlier placebo case I mentioned. So even if you think that the fragility of the glass must make a difference, I think you can still say that it's not properly the cause or even a cause of the breaking. So I personally think that causes are only like particulars, so I only think that events or substances are causes, and I don't think that properties are causes. But nonetheless, I think that fragility and the exercise of the fragility must surely have been causally relevant. That much we need to say. For if a power were not causally relevant, even when it was manifested, it would be completely inert. And what reason would we have for positing powers as genuine properties if they were inert and didn't make any difference? So I think that if we are realist about powers, we must assume that powers and their being exercised must make a difference, and must make a difference to whether the end states of the manifestation processes and the intermediate stages in this process occur. Sorry. However, once we try to spell out how powers can play a causal role in the production of the events involved in the manifestation, we quickly encounter a problem which is structurally similar to Kim's downward causation problem. As we have noted, most, perhaps even all, powers in nature are not manifested instantaneously, but typically the manifestation involves a process of different stages, which has a certain structure. And if we stick to this Kim's picture of hierarchically ordered layers of reality, these stages can usually be distinguished already on the same level of reality as the one at which we ascribe the power in question. So of course we can become more fine-grained, but we can already kind of distinguish these stages on the same level. So here is just, again, my naive description of what happens when water dissolves sugar. And A to D, they do look kind of, I don't have a really good grip on how to distinguish levels, but to me A to D seem to be on the same level of reality as water solubility or the property of water solubility is. And I do think some such account is even true. There may be a more fine-grained account in addition, but something like this will be true when water dissolves sugar. Now, when you describe the different stages of this process, you may begin to wonder, naturally begin to wonder, what is responsible for the occurrence of the individual steps at each stage of the process. So you have these stages, A, B, C, blah, blah, on to D. And then you may ask, what is causally responsible for B's occurrence? And presumably the answer is A. Likewise, for C's occurrence, B, and so on. Perhaps you need some additional factors. So presumably, in order to explain how A was caused, you need something like what is usually called the stimulus for the manifestation of the power. In this case, it's the sugar was put into water. And in addition, you probably also need kind of background features which has to be present and which will be also causally relevant to the occurrence at each step. These background conditions will include the presence of two kinds of states. On the one hand, features of the external environment of the transaction, and on the other hand, internal features of the objects involved. So for instance, the intrinsic properties of the sugar and the water. But now it seems once we have put these states and events together, it seems we have assembled all the causally relevant factors which are needed for the occurrences of A, B, C, and D. And in particular, when we focus, as in our presentation of Kim's argument, on cases of deterministic causation, the presence of these factors and events, it seems, is already a sufficient condition for and provides a sufficient explanation of the occurrences of A, B, C, and D. But now, of course, when we consider this list of relevant causal factors, something crucial seems to have been left out, namely the powers of the sugar and the water solubility of the sugar and the power of the water to dissolve the sugar. Or to be a bit more precise, what seems to have been left out is the exercise of these powers. That the power of solubility is possessed by the sugar may well figure among the internal states of the cube of sugar which formed the background conditions for the causation of A, B, C, and D. But it seems that no further causal contribution of the power is included in the list. And as we shall shortly, the present possession of the power is in the list cannot make up for this absence. So it seems we have a genuine problem here. If each step in the process is already caused by the preceding step, or the stimulus, together with relevant background conditions, what causal work remains for the power itself, or it's being exercised to do? Why should it also be relevant that the power is exercised? Or putting it in terms of causal explanation, if each of the steps and the end state of the process can already be causally explained by the factors included in our list, what explanatory role could be played by the exercise of the relevant powers of the water and the sugar? Wouldn't it lead to a case of explanatory and causal overdetermination if we ascribed a causal or explanatory role to the latter too. And now perhaps you see I have already kind of like the rhetoric I'm using. This sounds like already a bit like the rhetoric often used in presenting the downward causation argument by Kim. And it does indeed seem to me that the argument we are getting here has very close and easily recognizable parallels to Kim's downward causation argument. So schematically, we can put the argument like this. The occurrence of each stage of the manifestation process can be explained by the occurrence of earlier stages and the obtaining of certain background conditions. The exercise of the power does not figure in this list. Any additional causal explanation in terms of the fact that the power has been exercised or is exercised would lead to causal and explanatory overdetermination. The relationship between the exercise of a power and the occurrence of the different stages during the manifestation is not plausibly thought of as one of overdetermination. So that the power is exercised cannot be causally relevant for the occurrence of A, B, C, and D. And it seems just to put in mental properties for exercise of powers and underlying physical properties for what I call the earlier stages and background conditions. And then you have more or less Kim's argument. Now at this point you might have the suspicion that in constructing this argument I have left out one crucial feature which will save powers from being causally inert. For you may think I have hitherto not given sufficient weight to the fact that among the states and events causing the stages A, B, C, and D, there also figure the states of the object involved, and these also include that the objects have the relevant powers. At the very least, the state is bound to be among the substance's relevant internal states, which form part of the background condition. And this does not be enough to ensure a causal role for the power and its manifestation, even if only an indirect one. And this would indeed be a crucial difference to Kim's argument, where the mental properties don't have any causal role and the mental phenomena don't have any causal role to play. But alas, this indirect causal role is not quite good enough, for it is not properly a causal role of the exercise of this power. And this, I think, is something that's a very extensive debate about the causal analysis of power ascriptions and their failure has shown us, namely that we cannot assume that the contribution of the exercise of a power can be construed in terms of the causal contribution of the possession of this power. Even if a state of the possession of the power contributes to an effect, and even if this effect is of the kind typically connected with the manifestation of the power, this does not guarantee that the effect is a result of the exercise of the power. And here, yes, and the reason is, of course, that the causal contribution of the state or event can be of the wrong kind. And I would repeat my point here. This is exactly, again, the cases of deviant causal chains I have mentioned earlier. So think again about the dictator case, or think again about the placebo case. So here, possession of the relevant power does play a causal role. The effect is the typical effect of this power of fragility and the healing power of the medicine. But still, in the particular case, that the person is healed from her headache or that the glass is broken is not a result of the exercise of this power. So by consequence, if the only role played by the power in the production of an effect was that the state of the objects possessing this power causally contributed to the effect, then this would mean that the power's exercise would remain without any causal role at all. So the Kim-style argument I have constructed in the last section would show that powers, or more properly the exercises, would be causally irrelevant and cannot make a difference, at least in a deterministic setting, to whether the end states and intermediate stages of the power manifestation process occur. And this, I think, on the one hand, is really a result that an adherent of robust realism about powers is just committed to deny. That was the earlier point that if powers were inert, we just would have no reason to postulate them. An inert power sounds like a contradictio in adjectum. No, sorry, contradictio in adjecto. Sorry. Have to be precise about the Latin, even not. At the same time, this would be a result which is kind of very hard, if not impossible, to reconcile with our everyday explanatory practices. So because we do often take explanations like the sugar dissolved because of its water solubility to be perfectly good and even true, often true explanations. So the Kim-style argument I have presented must be unsuccessful if you are a realist about power. But what is wrong with it? And I think partly one could just try to reapply the masses of answers which have been kind of produced for Kim's own argument with slight modifications to this case. I think this would be one option. But I actually think, I will not do this also for time reasons, but I want to suggest the flaw in the Kim-style argument which I have presented goes deeper. Its basic error lies in thinking that the power and the sequence of events involved in its manifestation are factors which compete with one another for causal influence, such that the causal influence of the one leaves less room for the causal influence of the other. And I think for a realist about powers, this conception really must be wrong. The events involved in the manifestation process, they are themselves ingredients, you might want to say, of the power's manifestations. So if they or similar events did not occur, then the power wouldn't be manifested either. But they do not fully constitute the manifestation process on their own, because they must, in addition, be due to an exercise of the underlying power. And this was exactly the point I made earlier, that I believe the Aristotelian conception of powers, which says exactly that it is not just the chain, the sequence of stages, is kind of superior to the Russellian one. So reference to the fact that the power is exercised cannot be eliminated and cannot be made redundant by the fact that we can also refer to the earlier steps and external factors in explaining why a certain stage of the process occurs. And actually, I think this reference is not even made redundant when the event causal links are deterministic. At the same time, reference to the earlier steps in the sequence is not made redundant by reference to the fact that the power is being exercised either, because the earlier steps do explain something important, namely why a particular step, say B rather than C, is happening at this very moment. This cannot just be explained by reference to the fact that the power is being exercised. Thus, on the realist picture about powers, the exercise of the power and the causal influence of the steps of the manifestation process will not turn out to be competing for causal influence. And only if they were competing for causal influence would any problematic causal overdetermination be possible. So if this is right, the exclusion argument for the case of powers and their manifestations can be rejected by realists about powers. But now, I guess probably some of you will already begin to guess how this might also help us with Kim's original argument. It helps us because both the exclusion argument for powers and the answer to it that I have just sketched have been completely neutral as to whether the substages of the process, stages of the process, were situated on the same level of reality as the power which was manifested or on a different one. So I have formulated the argument a bit naively, like as if all was happening on one level. But I think it's easy to see that this assumption is neither essential to the setup of the problem nor the response. The problem would have arisen in the same way, and the answer would have been exactly the same, non-competition, if we had taken the stages of the manifestation process to be situated at lower levels of reality. So if we had gone down to the molecular level. Yeah. Consequently, even if we suppose that the power and the substages of the process are situated on different levels, the same answer will still hold good, because the crucial point still applies. In order to make sense of a causal role of the power's exercise, we cannot think of this exercise and of certain other factors involved in the production of the different stages as competing with one another for causal influence. And if we must reject the competition assumption anyway, then we should reject it regardless of whether these other factors are same level or lower level ones. Now, how could a kind of defender of Kim's argument perhaps has a kind of comeback at this point? Because he could try to recast the original downward causation argument completely in terms of power manifestations. So he could argue that the stages at the lower level are already causally explained by exercises of powers at these lower levels, and that this rules out that they can also be influenced by exercises of higher level powers as well. And if this were possible, then there might still be a specific exclusion problem which arises for higher level powers. Not for powers in general, but like specifically for higher level powers. But I think it's important to note that the exclusion claim specifically adapted to powers is very, very different from the exclusion claim for events that Kim has used in his original argument. And as a result, cannot draw on the considerations which give the latter at least some small prima facie plausibility. I think Kim's original exclusion argument really crucially depends on this idea that we are tracing back the causal ancestry of an effect by going back kind of step by step an event causal series. So if you think that about two distinct events which are both candidate causes for a certain effect, and imagine both to represent different causal sequences leading up to this effect, there is some prima facie attraction to the idea that both these kind of separate independent sequences are somehow competing for causal influence. A bit like kind of two marksmen aiming at one victim. You think only one can get him first, otherwise we have a case of overdetermination. With respect to powers and the stages of the manifestations, by contrast, the idea that we have a competition here between the power on the one hand and the stages of the manifestation process on the other has turned out to be flawed anyway. As we have seen, we must kind of get rid of this competition for causal influence idea anyway if we are to make any sense of the causal irrelevance of powers. Why should this be different if we look at the stages of the manifestation process in more fine-grained way? The natural thing to suppose, I think, is that the non-competition result applies to the relationship between powers and lower level powers and events as well. Or at least I think the burden of proof that is not so very squarely rests with philosophers who want to recast the exclusion argument for higher order powers in the way I have indicated. Now, with some shock, I have noted that I have only 4.5 minutes left, and I very quickly, but I don't think we have a sign which says less than 5 minutes left.
Yes, we have.
Oh no. But we haven't raised that yet. But let me very quickly go to the second topic, which is a kind of very different one. That is the question of freedom and indeterminism. And I guess you kind of know that the debate about the revival of power realisms has had very prominent consequences for the freedom of will debate, especially in the compatibilist camp. And one kind of development I want to look at in the remaining 4 minutes here is particularly a view which holds that we can explain autonomy and more responsibility in terms of characteristic capacities of agents. And the capacity which has been most discussed in this respect is the capacity of reason's responsiveness, or the power to rightly react to reasons. Now, most kind of adherents of this view are de facto compatibilists. But I think the general idea that autonomous agency derives from a capacity to react to reasons should also be appealing to many incompatibilists. For when an action issues from my capacity of reason's responsiveness, this, it seems, provides a good account of how this action can be traced to be something in me, so that I can be considered as its source. Nor do I think is it obvious that the reason's responsiveness account is really a compatibilist one. I mean, it's usually presented as one, but this may well be false. And I think one reason for doubt here is that the power to respond to reasons doesn't seem to be a fixed one, where my response to a certain situations and the reasons which are relevant there is determined. Rather, reason's responsiveness seems to be an essentially adaptive capacity which is open to finding out further relevant features of the situations which might have a bearing on what I want to do. And I think, very kind of briefly, I think this kind of adaptiveness and flexibility plays two very important roles. So on the one hand, it's very important for learning processes, and I think this slightly ties into some of the things Thomas said. And also, it's kind of very important because we believe that if we didn't have this openness, we would be like robots. It's a very, I think, common worry that because robots or lower order animals, at least, they will not change certain courses of behavior even when this kind of behavior is no longer rational or no longer conducive to the aim. And that's a feature which is often called factiousness. And it's important for us that kind of we are not factious, and that we are flexible. And some philosophers have argued that flexibility and non-factiousness may require indeterminism. For instance, like Helen Stewart has done this. Yeah. And it's the last slide even. Okay. So I think this is an argument for incompatibilism which would just come from reason's responsiveness. Now, does it make a difference if we think about reason's responsiveness in a Humean event causal framework or in a powers framework? And I do think it does make a difference, especially when it comes to the question whether open and flexible reason's responsiveness is compatible with microphysical determinism, if this were to hold. I mean, I don't think microphysical determinism holds, but I think it's a question of whether this would be compatible. And this, I think, is because the key question changes when we move from a Humean event causal framework to a powers framework. I believe in an event causal framework, the natural question is, was it necessary that a certain result occurred given all the states and events before? And of course, if microphysical determinism is true, the answer seems to be yes, because then we have to look at the total state of the world, including the microphysical states. By contrast, when we shift to a framework provided by a robust realism about powers, the key question will become a different one. Namely, what powers did the action or decision issue from? And this latter power, so for instance the power of reason responsiveness, can be an indeterministic tendency, even if full determinism at the microphysical level is supposed to be true. For remember, now it's really the last slide. Remember, what determines whether a power is a disposition or a mere tendency is how tightly the presence of the conditions for the exercise of the power and the exercise of the power are linked. So whether the power has to be exercised under these conditions or not. And it's perfectly possible and even highly likely that the conditions for the exercise of reason's responsiveness, for the power of reason's responsiveness, are characterized in such a way that they are characterized only at the personal level, and in this case they are characterized in a way that the power does not have to be exercised when these conditions are present. And why? Because microdeterminism may be true to factors which just don't show up, don't have any reflection on the personal level. So I do think when we think about reason's responsiveness as the key to autonomy, there is really something that can be gained, or at least this kind of differs when we switch to powers, because then it seems reason's responsiveness can be compatible with microphysical determination. This does not mean that there are other considerations to show that free will is incompatible with microphysical determinism, but at least the openness of reason's responsiveness is compatible. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mayr. I invite Professor Dietmar von der Pfordten from the University of Goettingen for the final response of this conference.
Yes, thank you very much also to Daniel von Wachter and his team for this really exciting and stimulating conference. I enjoyed it a lot, and I will not make a very long comment because we are at the end of the conference, and the paper of Professor Mayr was very stimulating and rich, and I don't want to repeat the steps, which I have not many objection. I will only raise one fundamental point and elaborate on this point. So he said, are powers game changers? And I would agree. Powers can be game changers, but the question is, are they good game changers? And is the game changed to a better game or to a worse game? This is a decisive question, I would say. And in order to discuss this a little bit, I will ask, what are powers? And I collected during this conference some of the proposals of our power theorists. I wouldn't say it's a power industry, but it's near to the power industry and not for electrifying cars, but discussion. So even Erasmus Mayr had two different definitions. Powers are capacity, which is a very wide definition, is in his paper, and he says early. And then a quite demanding definition: powers are directed at certain change, do not compete with the stages of manifestation on causal influence. This is this Molnar-Aristotelian style realism, which is a very robust realism. But these two definitions are quite different. The one is quite open, and the other one is quite demanding. And my question is, at this stage, but this is on a minor point, why directed at a certain change? I would say there can be the power of the fundament of a house which sustains the house, and this is not a change. This is just a non-change. Stephen Mumford has also very, very wide powers are properties. Georg Molnar says powers are properties with physical intentionality, unground dispositions. Thomas Pink said this morning, capacity to produce, prevent outcomes. Why only outcomes? Why not some sort of action in itself? If I'm singing, perhaps this is a power, and there's no outcome beyond the singing. And Gerd Keil had a more demanding conception of power. So we have, and this is only six. I talked to Stephen Mumford. He proposed in 5 seconds 5 other proposals what powers are. So you have a whole plethora of proposals, and this makes me worry a little bit about this whole power industry, power business, because if there are so different understanding of a game changer, then it's like string theory. It can change everything to a number of 10 on 500. Billiards of possibilities. What is, on a meta level, one could ask, what is the purpose of introducing powers? This is now a meta level question on introducing. I think the purpose might be, but please correct me, Professor Mayr, to search for a third way between Hobbesian or Humean monism, naturalism, reductionism, and Cartesian or Kantian dualism between natural causation and autonomous decision. For example, the Kantian model, homo phenomenon and homo noumenon. But the problem is that with this game changer, you could also say this magic thing, power, you blur the distinction between natural cause and personal action. It is unified in one phenomenon, in one concept of power. We saw these also in the lecture of Professor Pink, and this seems to be a problem with this game changer or great unifier, I would say, or great blur. And this is even a dilemma which I see in this game changer. If the chosen understanding of power is too thin and non-demanding, for example, power is capacities. Remember the first definition of Erasmus Mayr, or power is property, definition of Mumford. It covers the problem of agent causality by word definition, but does not really address it and gives no rational basis for problem solution. And second problem, if the chosen understanding of power is thicker and more demanding, Mayer's second robust realism, it already opts for a sort of openness and free will by definition. These are, in my view, the two horns of the dilemma with this power game changer. And in the end, Mayr definitely chooses the second horn. He elaborates on his robust realism. And I repeat the slides 11 and 12, where this magical trick is employed. What is wrong with the argument, the competition assumption that the powers and the stages occurring during its manifestation compete with one another for causal influence, and only we have composition we could get, and so on. And he says they shouldn't compete. It's inbuilt in powers that they are not competing with this stage view, this union stage view. And then on slide 12 he says, neither the formulation of nor the answer to the crucial presuppose that the power and the stage of the were situated at the same level of reality. If non-competition must be accepted anyway, there's no reason not to accept it when the power and the stages are on different levels either. And this is a result of the game changer. But this makes me worry. This makes me worry methodologically. But I would say, as a fundamental objection, the result of the solution of the Kim-style argument and the free will problem is already built in the assumption of robust Molnar cum Aristoteles understanding of powers. In the Erasmus Mayr version of employing this power game changer or magical new phenomenon. So the whole business, which has to be before you give the definition and say, I assume this yes, Aristoteles cum Molnar or Molnar cum Aristoteles robust realism of power. You have to produce convincing arguments or convincing grounds for this assumption. If you make this assumption, we accept it, okay, then you have the game changer and you can change the game. But no one who is skeptical about these powers and is a hard-nosed determinist or naturalist have to accept this robust realism about powers. And I would then say perhaps we should employ an alternative methodology which might be a result of Occam's razor methodological principle in philosophy. Don't replace or at least smear quite natural and widely accepted distinction and problem formulations with less analytic and less precise problem formulations. This is the thing and applied on our problem. So don't replace or at least smear the question how human decisions can be effective in a world of widespread natural causality by an artificial, unprecise and heavily debated term like power. And if you compare on this conference, especially today or also yesterday, the non-power formulations of the problem, like were given by Daniel von Wachter or Ansgar Beckermann, or also Paul Neger, with the power solution. I think the game changer power does not turn the discussion of the problem of openness or free will to a better game. I don't think this is really a better game in methodology. So go instead deeper in the quite natural, widely understood and accepted problem formulation and proposed systematic solution, which can be debated rationally without introducing this magical, mysterious game changer of powers, which is not really accepted. And you have seen that we have so many different definitions which compete, and I can see no reason why one of these definitions should win. So we really don't know what powers are, and this cannot be a good game changer to make the game better. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just keep this and I will just reply to it
okay.
by the slides. No, thank you very much. I'm I don't quite know which point to start. Actually, I'll start at the end. So I do not think that kind of power is like an artificial term. I think it has a very kind of old tradition, so to speak. I think kind of like, when was the metaphysics written of Aristotle? 2,300 years ago? It's kind of like, I think it's pretty good standing in philosophical history.
But
and
what
so,
is the Greek term for power?
Is it energeia? I mean, my Greek is dunamis. It's in energeia. It's kind of like actualization, exactly. But I think that's pretty, and I do think that kind of like people who nowadays speak of power, they do kind of connect to the Aristotelian idea. So I don't think it's like a artificial game, artificial thing. I do think it's something that has proved kind of like very valuable during the debate. And also, I do think, of course, there are kind of like, it's heavily debated what exactly a power is. But if we started not using philosophical terms which were heavily debated, I guess we wouldn't be using many philosophical terms at all. So you could say the same about substance, about event. And there are also these kind of huge debates. So I do think kind of power is a good term and kind of good concept. I also think that kind of, you're right, of course, that I kind of have not given a story about why one should accept realism about powers. This would have been a different talk for a different series of books or whatever you have you. But I think there have been very good arguments, not only like the traditional, but only like also like since the 90s, where kind of powers have been, I think, very well rediscovered. And to be very honest, I don't see this problem. So it's already built into the assumption of a robust Aristotle understanding. What is true is that, like, surprisingly, if my argument is right, then once you accept the Aristotle understanding of powers, you also get a solution to the Kim-style argument. Let's leave out the trivial. No, but I think it's not like cheating. It's something like when you but so you accept P, for instance. You didn't, when accepting P, you didn't think about Q. Many people who accept kind of like Aristotle style of realism about powers, they don't yet think about the Kim-style argument. So you have accepted P without thinking about Q. And now it turns out, by accepting P, you are also committed to Q. And then, of course, you could also think, but you already built Q into the original acceptance of P. But I think that if this is a kind of built-in thing, then I'm completely happy with it. I think that's just one of the interesting things you get in philosophy, that by seeing that you accept one position, you also get something else. So if this is a thing of built-in, I'm completely happy with that. But I don't think it's cheating, because because the considerations which kind of make a power's ontology plausible are not considerations which kind of already explicitly involve that we want to solve the Kim-style argument. With the dilemma, I don't think, I mean, you said kind of like it was kind of your suggestion, or you kind of guess what it might be. I don't think it's really true, because I think many people really believe that powers are very often just like completely like everyday physical powers. So there are many power realists actually just come from philosophy of physics. And so if you think about Bird or people who really think that kind of powers, accepting realism about powers, and Paul could name probably many more. I even think like Stephen Mumford, who's along here, kind of originally started out with kind of like considerations about physics and the best ontology we should have if we take science seriously, so to speak. So I think the motivations for accepting a power's ontology are very, very diverse. Sorry, it's not the dilemma, sorry, it's this one, the purpose. I kind of said they are very, very diverse. And I don't think they are naturally this. And was not quite sure about the dilemma, but I do think, yes, I think I go for the second possibility, but I don't think it's a horn. I think it's just, it's a good thing to pick. Yeah. And I mean, you are of course right that there are these different understandings, but yeah, I think unfortunately that's the case about most interesting philosophical concepts. Thanks.
Good. May I say only one word? I think when you started with your talk, power is a game changer. You already introduced the joker in the game. And then you say this joker is in the different causation things. There are different causes, and this is a joker, and then it's built in. Huh? So then you can make it. This is what you are not cheating. You are saying at the beginning, in the first word, you are saying what is the consequence of your assumption. Huh? But this demands that you give some reasons to take these powers.
No, I mean, what I think you're right is that, of course, there's a big debate about whether you should accept powers anyways. It's a big debate, which I couldn't say anything about here. But the point is, I think what you say would be problematic. If already at the stage where we think about why we should accept powers, we kind of explicitly say, we want to accept powers because we want to solve the Kim problem. Then I think there would be a slightly kind of like circularity. But that's not how it happens. So considerations of why kind of powers ontologies are accepted are usually independent from downward causation issues. And that's why I think it's kind of like, it's even a nice thing that you find out, one theory is kind of nice for different reasons, and now it solves a different problem for you as well.
Yes, Professor Dietmar has first